let's get started walking you through some of the steps to create the Apple Quilt block. I have all of my pieces for one block cut out. You can see there are quite a few pieces for this block, and then I have them kind of just sorted into little piles so I know where they are. We are going to start, if you are looking for the instructions, they start on my copy, they start on page 8, which I have the paper copy. Digital copy should be the same. If not, I'll go ahead and note where that starts. So I'm just going to follow the directions on this pattern so that you guys can follow along with it as you're sewing at home, that it kind of corresponds with each other. So to start, we are going to work with the stem pieces first. In the directions, it notes how to kind of snowball the corners to make these leaf blocks. There's 4 apples and 2 different leaves. They're mirror images of each other. So you're going to do the same thing twice. What I want to do first is kind of start you out by explaining a technique called snowballing. I don't know if that's honestly what it's called. It's just what I call it. I've heard a few people call that. Also, I think clipping a corner maybe. So what you're going to do is start out with one of the pieces of background fabric. And for my background fabric, I am using Bleached Denim by Riley Blake in Sparkler. You can also use Bleached Denim Blossom or Bleached Denim Confetti Cotton Solid, whatever it is that you like. Personally, I have the Sparkler in stock right now at my house, so that's what I am using, so I don't have to order more fabric. So the first thing we do when you snowball is you take the smaller of the pieces and you draw a diagonal line down the center. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to my leaf piece and I'm going to place this on top. I'm going to make sure that all of my edges are even, and then I'm going to go ahead and stitch on the line. I'm going to stitch right on that line from corner to corner, and I'm going to do that with the bigger piece, and then I'll do the same thing with the smaller piece, and I'll share a couple of tips with you. I'm going to go ahead and sew that, and then I'll show you what to do next. I've stitched on that line. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my quilt ruler and my rotary cutter, and I'm going to put the 1/4 inch line on my quilt ruler right on that seam I stitched, and then I'm going to go ahead and cut that off. And then this is extra. And then I kind of go back and forth. You can flip this up and press it seams to one side. You can also press it open. I noticed that pressing it open seems to work a little bit better when you're dealing with smaller pieces like that. So I'm going to go ahead and press this one open just so you can see how that goes. After I do that, then I'm going to take my other piece, the smaller piece, and I'm going to do the same thing to that bottom corner. All right, there I have the piece stitched, and I have gone ahead and pressed the seams open. Like I said, normally I'm always a press to the side kind of a quilter, but when I have smaller pieces, I just feel like sometimes it works a little better to go ahead and press them open. You're going to go ahead and do the same thing 3 more times, making sure that so you'll do 1 more exactly like this, and then 2 more that are mirror images of each other. And there's a diagram on the pattern that shows you which way to press your, to sew your seams. So I think visually it's a little easier just to go ahead and look at the pattern for that. The next thing you're going to do after that is you are going to snowball the corners of your apple piece. And the apple piece is this larger piece of fabric, and you're going to use the pieces noted on the pattern. And this time you're going to go ahead and you're going to snowball all 4 pieces. So go to your machine and do that, and then I will show you how to assemble the block. The rest of it is pretty straightforward. Now that you've got some of the finer piecing done for this block, you are ready to assemble one of the apple sections. There is a diagram on your pattern on page 9 that goes over this with the exact sizes, but just to kind of visually give you an idea, you're going to sew your stem to your small piece of background fabric. After you've sewn those and pressed them, you're going to sew the leaf to one side, you're going to sew the square to this side and a rectangle to the other side. You're going to sew one rectangle to each side of the apple, press all your seams, and then you're going to join the top and the bottom pieces. I'll go ahead and sew this section together and this section together so you can kind of get a visualization of what it should look like after it's done. I want to share with you a technique that I use sometimes when sewing small pieces of fabric together. Here I am sewing a small piece of background fabric to the stem piece. One piece is 1 by 1, one is 1.5 by 1.5, which in quilting terms is, in my opinion, quite small of a piece. What it is referred to generally is called leaders and enders. Leader and ender is using scrap fabric at the beginning and end of your seam to get a more accurate seam. Sometimes what will happen when you're sewing smaller pieces like this is your machine will take a couple stitches before it kind of really gets going and like gets a real tight seam. So what this does is it allows you to kind of get the first couple kind of unreliable stitches, I guess that's a good way to put it, is first couple unreliable stitches out before you sew on the seam you want to sew on. And then also I notice personally when I get close to the end of a seam, I seem to have a tendency to kind of push too far to the right or the left because I know I'm getting ready to like pull it off my machine. So then that you would go ahead and sew an ender piece after just to kind of help you get a long straight seam. There are ways to do leaders and enders that create quilts. A lot of people will take 2x2 squares and use those as their leaders and enders, or like an extra charm pack. But I'm just using scraps. If you want to Google it, there are lots of ideas for leaders and enders quilts. So to do this, you're just going to start. Obviously, this is a scrap. It doesn't matter which, right side up, right side down. You're just going to start sewing. I'm going to get this thread out of my way. And then I'm going to get to the end here. And then we'll take my piece I want to sew. And I know right here is my scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm just going to line that up right there. And then feed this through. And then when I get to that point, I'm going to go ahead and stitch my ender piece. You don't have to stitch all the way to the end. What that allows you to do is see, mine is still even a little bit off right there. So I think I might go in and stitch that again. But in general, it lets you get a straighter seam. That's like, you can see I'm off by like a 1/16 of an inch right there. So I'm going to leave those pieces attached. And I am going to sew this again so that seam is straight all the way across. Okay, I'm much happier with that. So now when I go to my iron and press this piece, I have a much straighter seam. Like I said, I usually only use this technique when working with smaller fabric pieces, just because I feel like those little pieces are just so hard sometimes to manipulate under the machine, and just having it kind of like attached to something helps me quite a bit. Sewn the bottom of the apple piece together and the top. I wanted to point something out just because I don't want you guys to get frustrated if it's not necessary. When you're dealing with smaller pieces of fabric like this and you're snowballing a seam, that seam is being sewn on the bias, and fabric like this stretches on the bias. So it's normal to get a little bit of distortion in your seam as you sew. You do your best not to have that happen, but it is natural to have a little bit of it just because you're sewing the fabric in a direction that it wants to stretch. So you can see that my top seam is a little kind of wonky there, but it's okay because I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance here, and what I'm going to do when I sew these two pieces together is I am going to pull this straight across, and then on the back you can see here where a little bit of this kind of yellow is sticking up. That will get made up in the seam allowance. So for this piece, this is going to be a scant quarter inch seam allowance all through here. This little part might be 1/8 of an inch, but you've got plenty of fabric to work with. But that's just kind of a way that you can kind of get yourself an extra little bit of fabric if you do have a little bit of distortion like that. Also make sure as you're pressing that you're going straight up and down and not side to side. And you can also maybe try pressing without steam. I kind of have mixed results with accuracy with that. But if you are accustomed to pressing with steam and you notice that your seams are all a little bit wonky, I would go ahead and maybe try and press without steam. And again, make sure you're going straight up and straight down and hit your fabric with a little bit of starch. I'm going to go ahead and sew this seam and then sew the other 3 blocks exactly the same way as shown in the diagram. And then I'll just kind of very simply show you how to assemble the rest of the block. I have my 4 apple blocks sewn. And I want to point something out before I go too much further. As I was constructing it, I noticed if you look on the quilt I made, the block with the tiny strawberries, the leaf is off to the right on both of them. When I was making my block, I went ahead and did it with the leaf on the left. So just to keep it consistent, I have done both of mine with the leaf on the left. And so when I assemble mine together in a grid, it will look a little bit different than yours if you want to make it exactly like mine. So I've got my 4 blocks here sewn. You're going to go ahead and sew the 2 to each other here, 2 to each other here, and then sew the 12.5 inch by 1.5 inch strip to the middle. In the end, your block should be very close to 12.5 by 12.5, as close as you can get it. You can see that my blocks are not perfectly squared up. I am a little bit short on one of these edges. I'm going to make that up with my seam allowance, so I am not going to square up at this point. If you want to square up at this point, these should be 6.5 wide by 6 tall, but it's totally up to you how you want to handle that. I'll go ahead and stitch these together so you can see what the finished block looks like. Here you can see my completed block. I've sewn all 4 of the apples together and have sewn the strip to the center. After you're done, go ahead and do your best to square this up to as close to 12.5 by 12.5 as you can. If it's like 12 3/8, that's okay. If you're coming up with your blocks too short, I can guarantee you your seam allowance is larger than a scant 1/4 inch. Scant 1/4 inch means that you are, if you're looking at a ruler with a 1/4 inch mark, this is the 1/4 inch. A scant 1/4 inch would make your seam allowance 1 thread length, if I use a pencil, 1 width of thread on the inside of that 1/4 inch mark. So that's what's considered a scant 1/4 inch seam. So go ahead, double check your seam allowances, check your pressing, make sure you're going straight up and straight down. Use starch and enjoy it. I hope you learned something while you're doing this, and I look forward to next week when we go ahead and tackle the pineapple block, which is one of my favorite blocks in the quilt.